How do you feel the two conventions went in terms of response from voters?
These were really, really different conventions from anything that we've had before. Having to adapt quite late in the day to the virtual world meant that both parties had to be very creative. Now, when the Democrats went and they had to go first, they're not the incumbent, they're the challengers, so they go first in such events. It started off, and the first night sounded like a little bit like a superannuated Zoom call. Lots of quite similar speakers, but it was all quite upbeat. One got the sense of inclusiveness, of friendliness, and that built over the week. Biden was very lucky in that he had some very well regarded and well respected former presidents to endorse him. Michelle Obama, of course, got a fantastic reception, and there was an air of celebrity-ness, if such a word exists, to the whole event, and it got good ratings, and that will have really riled Donald Trump, because this is the ratings president. This is the president who operates in a kind of reality TV world and looks to see how many viewers he has rather than how successful his policies are. So the Republicans learned from the Democrats. They put on a very, very slick show, but they broke the convention of conventions. So for one thing, in the past, the political party convention has always been kept very separate from the job of the president. At this time of year, the president is a candidate running for re-election. And so by using the White House as a backdrop for his speech, by having the Washington Memorial in the background, by having Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, speaking from on the job, Trump pretty much trashed convention and also potentially broke the law. There's a law called the Hatch Act, which has been around since the 1940s. And it's supposed to separate politicking from running the country. But Trump trampled all over that. He still gave a pretty slick performance. His own acceptance speech was way too long. It really didn't cover anything new or deliver anything much about policy, but it cemented the positions we've got to know about him over the last 4 years. He made no great gaffes in it. He actually stuck to reading the autocue rather than going off on a fairly typical Trump riff. And in so doing, he will have cemented his base. We're not quite sure how big that base is. And certainly he got a little bit of bounce coming out from the back of the convention. Unsurprisingly, the big lead that Biden had going in has narrowed somewhat. And with the ferment that's going on in the country at the moment, that lead is likely to narrow much further. And we are really into what is going to be a very close race for the next 2 months.
Are there any standout moments or speeches that really stuck with you from the conventions, either from the Democrats or the Republicans?
Yeah, going back to the Democrats first, I would go for two women who really made a difference and really managed to become the news stories the next day. And actually not Kamala Harris, not the vice president nominee. First of all, Jill Biden. Not a lot of people knew Joe Biden's wife. She's a teacher, she's an educator. She was filmed in a classroom and she came across as warm, as natural, and as very well informed. And you put her up against Melania Trump, who doesn't come across as warm, who doesn't come across as particularly natural, who actually didn't give a bad speech on the Republican side and showed a bit more empathy than we've seen from her before, but still paled by comparison to Jill Biden. Also on the Democrat side, Michelle Obama. If she ran for office tomorrow, she would be elected, whether that was your local sheriff or probably for president. Very wisely, she has moved about as far from politics as she can for the position that she is in. But she gave a really, really good speech. She is a very natural, warm, engaging communicator, and that came across very, very well. On the Republican side, it was really interesting because the speeches that one remembers probably come from the family or from the extended members of the family. And that is because largely it was a convention dominated by the Trump family trying to set itself up as the next American political dynasty, and by staunch dyed-in-the-wool conservatives. I mean, who would have Rudy Giuliani on the closing night of a convention? I mean, he should have been pensioned off about 68 years ago, but still Rudy was there. But if you go back earlier in the week, Kimberly Guilfoyle stood in front of a microphone and shouted. She started off at 11 on the Richter scale and went upwards. Nobody can remember particularly what she said, but she pressed every trigger for Republican voters. In 5 or 6 minutes, she had that base roused. It's really important for Trump to try and pick up suburban voters, to pick up women voters, to get away from a narrow working class male base. Kimberly Guilfoyle was one of the speakers designed to do that, and in part will have been successful. The other memorable speech for me came from Donald Trump Jr. Again, it was pretty much a paean to his father. He didn't have anything particularly to say about policy, but you can see he is now being lined up as a future Trump politician. And that is really interesting because up until probably this convention, we'd seen the Trumps as being the outliers from the Republican Party. Now you realize that at the moment, the Republican Party is the Trumps. Donald, maybe he's calling for 12 more years. Maybe some of them will be Don Jr. Maybe some of them will be Ivanka. Certainly he sees the next generation following in his footsteps.
And so what can we expect to happen in the next 2 months?
This is going to be an incredibly ugly election fight. Trump thrives on chaos. And at the moment, he is stirring the ferment. He can't go out and campaign in the way that he'd like to. The mega MAGA rallies are not going to happen this year. He's not going to be able to surround himself with the donuts of loving followers. So what he's going to do instead is attack the Democrats. He's attacking the Democrats for what they're not. He's saying that they are left-wing socialists. Actually, the Harris and Biden ticket is pretty much the Democrats' version of the Waltons. And this ticket, even though it has been taken somewhat to the left by taking on the influence of Bernie Sanders over the last, not just this cycle, but the cycle 4 years ago, this is still a very centrist ticket. This ticket is probably akin to great Republican Eisenhower from back in the 1950s. It's the Republicans that have moved a long way to the right. But Trump is branding this Democrat ticket as about to bring in the worst kind of socialism. And America doesn't do socialism. So they're playing dirty already. They're using the race card through their very, very hostile reaction to Black Lives Matter and to the protests that have sprung up in Seattle and in Portland, and following the shootings of Black men by the police. I'm speaking to you on the day that Trump is going to Kenosha. He is not going to damp out the flames. He's pouring oil on the flames. He is using what he calls law and order, what most of the country are seeing as lawlessness, as his ticket. He's behind in the polls. He's behind on pretty much all of the models that have been made and are being predicted at the moment. So he needs a major turnaround and a major win. It's unlikely that a vaccine is going to happen in time. It's very unlikely that the economy is going to have rebounded to the extent that he wants. And actually, he's playing with fire in trying to reopen the US economy while people are still dying in their hundreds of thousands. Biden doesn't have it that easy, though. It's not going to be enough for him just to attack Trump. Trump, ever since he walked down the escalator in Trump Tower in 2015 to announce his candidacy, has been the story. He manages to get into the media cycle every day to lead the news, and everybody else is just left to comment on what he's had to say. Biden has to break that. To an extent, he can do it by showing up Trump for all of the bad that's happening in America at the moment and stating that it's happening on Trump's watch, under Trump's control, not fettered by anything that the government is doing at the moment. But equally, he has to paint a picture for a Democrat America that does things better. And at the moment, those positive messages are not getting across. Biden has to be out more. He has to be seen more. Harris needs to be seen more. We need some other good Democrat surrogates from around the country really breaking into that news cycle and getting the stories out. Biden should be winning by a mile. Trump has delivered a very ordinary Republican presidency with a really ugly edge to it. And Trump really should have no place in even getting close to 4 more years. But the biggest problem that the Democrats have got is that they have picked a guy to lead their ticket who is pretty old, who is pretty vanilla, and who really is not the greatest campaigner. Biden is a nice guy, but nice guys don't often win. Trump, not so much a nice guy, but he's still got a very strong chance.
And do you think that the pandemic is enough to turn off some of Trump's supporters?
Quite a lot of this year talking to Trump supporters. In fact, Kate, Trump supporters, some of them that you found for me on your research project last year. So I am still talking to Donna, the machine worker in Texas, to John, the pastor from Fort Worth, to Gordon, the pastor from Kansas, to people through the Midwest. Most of them, whatever Trump does, and he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, will still vote for him. They believe firmly that he offers the best chance of their socially conservative agenda being brought forward in America. They are the rugged individualists, the Americans who are keen to build a country where everybody gets the chance to thrive, but they're not actually going to give up any of their wealth to help anyone else along the way. They'll help family. They may get to the stage where they get very rich and they can put money back in to build that school, to build that theatre. But you're on benefit? Most Republican voters don't want to know. And they see a Biden America, a Democrat America, as reversing the last 4 years where there have been tax cuts, where regulation has been cut, where more conservatives have got onto more judicial benches than more or less at any time in the last 40 years. They don't want to see that change, even if they have to hold their noses and vote for Trump, the thrice married serial philanderer who is very difficult to pin down on what he actually stands for. They'll still vote for that Republican ticket.
Lastly, since it's quite an untraditional presidential election, do you think that the Democrats will be able to break the tradition of 8 years Republican, 8 years Democrats, and so on?
We've had some one-term presidents. We don't have to look back too far. George Bush Sr. was a one-term president on the Republican side. Jimmy Carter, back in the 70s, a one-term president on the Democrat side. So maybe in modern times we've got used to 8 years of Obama, 8 years of Bush Jr., 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of Reagan. So this is a pattern, but that pattern is broken up in between. And there is no guarantee. No party has a right to be in charge for 8 years. And what you would have in a normal presidency is that the president spends 4 years bringing the country together, putting together bipartisan legislation, so that when they come for re-election, those people wavering in the middle who will decide this election will be minded to vote for the president. This has not happened under Trump. He stood up at his inauguration and said he was going to be a president for all America, and that is just simply not true. What we have is a president for the very, very rich and for the white working class. He's really not done a lot for virtually anybody else in the United States. everything in logic says we should have a change this time round. But with a real Donald Trump, I'm using his Twitter title there straight away. With Trump, logic doesn't really work. Just expect the unexpected. I absolutely would not want to call this election at this time. It is Biden's to lose, but he could quite easily lose it.
Anything else to add?
This space. November the 3rd is going to be absolutely fascinating. We'll be following it from the Politics and IR department at the University of Reading. We'll be tweeting throughout the time. We have a number of Americans who are joining us over the next 2 months to give their views. By the time BISA comes to Reading in 2022 for the BISA annual conference, this will all be but a memory. We might be a year and a bit into the Biden presidency, or who knows, even the Kamala Harris presidency. Or it might be another 18 months into Trump, and we may be looking for another 2.5 years of chaos as presidency to follow that. But it will remain interesting.